Welcome. In our last lecture, we offered a very broad survey of religious themes in African history, including the spread of Islam and Christianity. For a very long time, well over 1,000 years, in fact, there was really only one place in Africa where Christianity could be called the dominant religion: Ethiopia. In this lecture, we examine the unique history of Ethiopia over the long haul. And indeed, this is one of those times in the course where I will stay with a subject for the sake of continuity. In this case, I'm going to carry it forward up to the present. I must say off the bat that Ethiopia is one of those places in Africa which seems to exert a very magnetic pull on many outsiders. I don't think I've ever met an American Ethiopianist who didn't consider it sort of the natural course of things, that one would choose to exert your energy in studying this place. They look at you as if you're a little bit crazy to consider anything else. Much of Ethiopia is high and mountainous country. It is associated with the Great Rift that we talked about in the second and third lectures, that tectonic plate movement which is responsible for the Red Sea, the Great Lakes of East Africa, and so forth. The volcanic and therefore rather fertile nature of the soils in Ethiopia has meant that for a very long time indeed, because Ethiopia certainly has one of the longest histories of agriculture anywhere in the world, for a very long time indeed, it has sustained and supported quite high population density. And even in the late 20th, 21st century, when we have heard on a number of occasions of devastating droughts and famine indeed in Ethiopia, its population density remains among the highest in Africa. Now, in the first centuries AD, a kingdom emerged in the area, the region we call Ethiopia. Its original name was Aksum. The basis of the kingdom's wealth was agricultural, as we might expect, but its external trade was largely in ivory, a theme that we'll encounter on a number of occasions in the next couple of lectures. In this case, the principal entrepot for trade between the interior, the Aksumite kingdom, and the outside world was the Red Sea port of Adulis. The people's language here was Ge'ez, the basis of modern Amharic, and they had already in these first few centuries of the modern era developed their own quite unique literary script, and it is indeed unique. There are a number of places where one sees script worked into works of art in great tapestries and so forth. Sort of Book of Kells style, where the written word will be embroidered and embellished and become part of the artwork. And it's a very striking component of a number of the works of art to come out of this part of the world. Amharic, an early literary script out of Africa. They built already in these centuries tall stone monoliths known as stelae to mark the tombs of rulers, and some of these still stand today. If you think of Cleopatra's Needle in central London, right on the Thames, but of course not originally built there, taken from Egypt and brought there, that is a very similar style to these monoliths called stelae. Now, we mentioned in our overview in the last lecture that a particular strain of Christianity developed early on in North Africa, specifically in Egypt, and became the dominant strain there. This was Coptic Christianity, committed, among other things, to a monophysite, that is a single divine nature of Christ, and became the dominant form of Christianity there, although, of course, eventually greatly overshadowed in Egypt by Islam. Coptic Christians from Alexandria in Egypt arrived in the 4th century A.D. In Ethiopia. And in fact, they achieved or got their great prize when the early Ethiopian king, or I should say Aksumite at this point, Aksumite king, converted to Christianity during his reign from 330 to 350 A.D. This is the same King Ezana, by the way, who eventually was responsible for dealing the death blow to the old iron production center of Merowe in the Kushite kingdom of Nubia. Now, by the 8th century or so, the rulers of Aksum, buffeted by Arab Muslim pressure predominantly from the east, as well as Persian, had retreated further south well into the central highlands of modern Ethiopia. This relatively greater degree of isolation developed a distinctive strain of Coptic Christianity in the Ethiopian church. It was marked on one hand by a very strong monastic tradition. And if you've ever get a chance to see the film footage of some of the monks who have established monasteries high up on these cliff sides or cliff tops and reaching it only by means of a series of rope ladders, which they then pull up after them, you definitely do get the impression that these were monks determined to, in a sense, leave the world behind. Strong monastic tradition on one hand. But on the other, the church hierarchy was very worldly indeed, and indeed in a quite material sense. They eventually controlled great wealth and vast domains of Ethiopia's land. Now, to jump forward a bit, in 1150, the founders of the so-called Zagwe dynasty seized power. Again, we see a succession of dynasties, not quite as many as we saw in ancient Egypt, not quite as long, obviously, but nonetheless, a similar kind of dynamic. Seized power and ushered in an era of aggressive Christian expansion in the region. In the early 13th century, Christian monks began building a series of churches out of solid mountain rock, carved out of solid mountain rock. These churches, in Kevin Shillington's words, testament to the strength and fervor of the Ethiopian Christian church, remain among the most astonishing architectural marvels of sub-Saharan Africa. You know, maybe I shouldn't even qualify that by saying sub-Saharan. I'm not sure anything can be compared to Egyptian pyramids. I guess it's a matter of sort of choose your marvel here, but this was not a case of constructing churches with stone carved or taken from quarries or what have you. This was taking the monolith itself, the huge part of a mountain, a flattish part of a mountainous region usually, and essentially sculpting a church out of it, complete with the pillars and seats and altars and so forth. So again, it may be closer to sculpture than construction as we normally think of it. Incredible churches. Now, in 1270, we have another dynastic change, and this ushers in the dynasty most famous in Ethiopian history, known as the Salamanid dynasty. Now, Salamanid obviously is a reference to none other than the legendary King Solomon of the Old Testament in this case. And I must say this is where Ethiopia's religious history gets to be very intriguing and interesting indeed. There came to be, what to call them, legends, myths, stories about the origins of Ethiopia and of the Ethiopian, of the entire culture and its religious life, which goes something like this. Long before the birth of Christ, none other than the Queen of Sheba, who does appear in the Bible in a number of cases, and is always assigned to Ethiopia. However, it's important to clarify that in sources like the Bible, Ethiopia was a very generalized term. It didn't necessarily apply to, what I've called Axum in the process of becoming, the Ethiopian kingdom. Ethiopia is a very generic term, and it basically referred to, sort of any part of inner Africa, any part of unquestionably black Africa. So, the notion that there was a Queen of Sheba from the Ethiopia we're talking about, or even that there was ever a Queen of Sheba at all, many consider this quite a mythical figure, perhaps open to question. Back to our story, though. Queen of Sheba leaves, goes to, ancient Israel, essentially, meets King Solomon, and, boy meets girl at this point, king meets queen. And in fact, Solomon and Sheba have a child, and they name David. Now, David eventually, according to this line of founding mythology, takes the name of Menelik, obviously a much more localized name as opposed to the biblical David, and is considered sort of, in this retelling of it, the founder of the Ethiopian state. And in fact, it goes further than this. The Ark of the Covenant, maybe the most revered artifact of all of the Old Testament, and probably created something like 1250 BC or something. A beautiful box, basically, but lined and covered with fine gold, and originally designed apparently to hold the two tablets of the Ten Commandments, written by the finger of God and so forth. The Ark of the Covenant has been missing for a very long time, and the Ethiopian Church's explanation for this is that Menelik, our son of Solomon and Sheba, actually brought it with him to Ethiopia. And the monks, the church clergy in Ethiopia, in fact, very definitely claim to this day that the Ark of the Covenant is inside a particular one of these Christian churches in Ethiopia. Now, no one, and I mean no one, is allowed, Ethiopian, African, European, outsider, insider, to see the Ark of the Covenant. So obviously it's a difficult sort of thing to establish. Maybe that's not of significance, though. Replicas of the Ark of the Covenant are, which are called tabot, T-A-B-O-T, tabot, are in fact placed in every single one of Ethiopia's 20-something thousand Christian churches. And they're brought out as part of religious processions, etc., etc. Now, again, with the cold eye of the historian, it's rather hard to accept this. After all, Solomon lived in about the 9th century BC. The kingdom of Axum certainly has been established by radiocarbon dating to the early centuries AD. Nonetheless, faith, that's what we're getting at here. And again, this has not only Christian connotations, but in a sense, connotations from the Old Testament as well. I might mention that, I've been speaking of a Christian outpost in Africa, but in fact, there was a community in Ethiopia for a very long time, and there's still some remnants of it, which was quite self-consciously Jewish. This was an African Jewish community known as the Falasha. A great number of them have actually left Ethiopia now. They came under considerable persecution, particularly after the fall of Haile Selassie that we'll come to in the 1970s, and actually a substantial number of them now have immigrated to, where else? To Israel, and have been accepted in Israel at this point. So there is a smaller, but nonetheless present Jewish tradition here as well. Now, this new Solomonic dynasty however grandiose its stories of origins, in fact, ceased building in stone. In fact, began a period over a couple of centuries where the capital was moved rather frequently, apparently in part because of exhaustion of natural resources. Some of the environmental deterioration in this heavily populated part of Africa may indeed have begun to show its face at this point. After all, when I mentioned early on that Ethiopia has become known for rather tragic kinds of famines and so forth, the first of the Bob Geldof organized aid concerts and so forth, which was in 1985, was specifically stimulated by excruciating imageries of famine out of Ethiopia. So both feast and famine present in the long run of this history. Now, over the next several centuries, Ethiopia was often under pressure from Muslim merchant and military penetration from the east and from quite fiercely independent Oromo pastoralists along the southern edge where it gets to be very dry and semi-desert of the area we call Ethiopia now. In fact, substantial portions of what we call Ethiopia in the modern sense were occupied either by Muslim powers like Odal or these quite independent pastoralists in the south. Closer to home, many regions were under the sway of local nobility and the church, both great landholders, rather than the central monarchy. It is for good reason that Ethiopia has often been described as feudal. In my surveys of African history, indeed, this is the one place that really seems to ring a bell with my understanding of medieval Europe, including kind of this ongoing tension which you see in practically every European country between a central monarchy and a very powerful local nobility, which is part secular and part religious. It's very hauntingly similar in a lot of ways. Now, in 1855, a provincial governor named Tewodros II, is actually sort of Amharic rendering of Theodore II, after modernizing his locally based army, seized the monarchy and took that title. I should say that's the title he took after taking the Ethiopian monarchy. Now, Tewodros was a modernizer in a number of respects, and he was successful in tilting this balance of power between a localized provincial nobility, religious or secular, and the central monarchy in his own favor for a time. Predictably, this earned him the enmity of those more peripheral kinds of powers within the kingdom. Now, in 1868, there occurred what these days we would probably call a diplomatic incident, which leads to the unhappy end of Tewodros, but in some respects also points us forward, not only in Ethiopia's case, but in some of the themes of this course. There was a British trade consul, again, far from a colonial ruler at this point, but an agent there basically to promote trade, which obviously Britain and the U.S. and probably Ethiopia has all over the world up to this day. In any case, for reasons that don't concern us, he was arrested and held by the government of Tewodros. And this led to a brief but quite forceful British invasion of Ethiopia. Something like 30,000 troops were dispatched here. Again, Britain really feeling its oats in the mid and late 19th century. Tewodros resisted, but he found here that the bad blood he had sown with the localized nobility and church leaders led to. It came back to haunt him because with their encouragement, a substantial number of his soldiers deserted, And in fact, in the ultimate confrontation with this British force, he himself took his pistol and committed suicide. Now, the British withdrew, and this is why I said it points forward a bit. The British withdrew, but we are approaching an era in 1868 when most of Africa was colonized by Europeans during the so-called scramble, and we're going to pay a great deal of attention to that in our coming lectures 19 and 20. Now, to look at Ethiopia in the time of this scramble, extremely important. In the late 1880s and 1890s, Italy moved to take over Ethiopia. Italy, in a sense, wanted a piece of this action, this magnificent African cake, which obviously Britain by the 1880s and 90s, France, Germany were so actively involved in the colonial carving up of Africa, and Italy wanted to get in on this process. By this time, the Ethiopian king was none other than Menelik II, taking his name from the legendary founder, who took power in 1889 and, like Tewodros, proved himself a skillful ruler and a military modernizer. Menelik grudgingly recognized the establishment of an Italian colony in the coastal strip of Eritrea that I'll come back to at the end of our lecture. That is, it's the coastal strip of what used to be all of Ethiopia along the Red Sea there. But in 1896, consider that date, 1896, and consider what's happening in the rest of Africa in terms of the colonial occupation. At a place called Ottawa in today's Ethiopia, Menelik II's forces inflicted a resounding defeat on the Italians and sent them packing. Now, the significance of Menelik's repulsion of the Italians can hardly be overstated. Aside from Liberia in West Africa, which was founded by freed African-American slaves, Ethiopia was literally the only place in Africa not colonized by Europeans in this period. So when I use the word unique about Ethiopian history at the beginning of the lecture as a Christian, outpost, it's unique in other ways as well. Independent Ethiopia was an inspiration to Africans in Africa and in the diaspora. And indeed, the emperor through much of the 20th century, whose name was Ras Tafari, but who later took the name of Haile Selassie, was seen by many as a symbol of African pride. And I'll come back to Haile Selassie in a moment. Well, the Europeans, in fact, the Italians, eventually returned with a vengeance. And it was none other than Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism, who took power in Italy in 1922, but in 1935 was determined to avenge his nation's humiliation of 1896, invaded Ethiopia, and seized most of his country. In exile, Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations and made a dramatic plea to international leaders to confront such aggression. Their failure to do so, they essentially ignored him. Their failure to do so was viewed by many, is viewed still by many, as a seminal moment. A moment, if you like, of appeasement, leading to World War II, and more so, as you can readily imagine, in the eyes of many Africans, both in Africa and the diaspora, a sign of essentially contempt for Africa itself. Now, Mussolini's success, well, in a lot of ways, it didn't last terribly long, but it certainly didn't last long in the case of Ethiopia. The Allied forces launched a major theater of war several major theaters of war in the Second World War in Africa, and one of them was definitely the Ethiopian front. They succeeded in expelling the Italians relatively early in the war in 1941, and somewhat reluctantly sort of re-recognized Haile Selassie and Ethiopia's restored independence. Again, another word about Ethiopia's meaning to Africans all over the world. and specifically Haile Selassie's. You know, I mentioned in passing last time so-called Ethiopianist churches, that is the independent churches created all over Africa. I mean, that's a term you find for these independent churches in Southern Africa. By independent, I mean independent of European control. Christian, but we don't want to be under that hierarchy and control. And the fact that they took the name of Ethiopian churches was in essence recognizing that even though they were thousands of miles, had no actual link with Ethiopia whatsoever, that they were drawing inspiration from that. African Americans in the United States organized a whole movement to, you know, the Save Ethiopia campaigns when Ethiopia was under this pressure and invasion from Italy. And in the diaspora more widely, of course, I mentioned Haile Selassie's original name of Rastafari. Well, of course, that's the basis for the quasi-religious, quasi-political movement. We think of Jamaica above all, probably, but in the West Indies and elsewhere, known as Rastafarianism, and they revere Haile Selassie as a political and religious symbol. So famous, I suppose he's the most famous Rastafarian of all, and that's Bob Marley. Actually composed a song which Marley rather curtly entitles War. But it's a song based, it takes much of its lyrics from a speech by Haile Selassie, a very noble speech in which Selassie was saying, I'm just giving you some of the lyrics of the song here, until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. And then Marley gives you his chorus of everywhere there will be war. Essentially, it's a kind of, you know, no justice, no peace sort of thing. Now, it's a very eloquent speech by Selassie, a very noble speech. Back at home, however, things were not quite so pretty in a lot of respects. If you look at Ryszard Kapuscinski's portrait of the last days I shouldn't say the last years of Selassie's reign, in his book The Emperor, you get a portrait of a man who certainly is extremely intelligent and extremely clever and wily in playing enemies off against one another. The almost fantastic parts of that book are the ways in which Selassie was able to, again, win this sort of tug of war between himself and local nobility. And I think it's fair to say that in a way he becomes kind of the last of the absolute monarchs in the world. I mean, some of the descriptions in that book of, you know, there's he's not the minister, but he's the keeper of the pillow. And Selassie was quite a short man. When he took his seat on the throne, you know, his feet were not meant to dangle for a second. And this guy's job for 26 years, he was telling Kapuscinski, was to slip that pillow under there, you know. Haile Selassie, then very much an autocrat at best, a dictator at worst. He met his own reckoning finally in 1974 after something like a half a century on the throne. Radical military officers, very committed Marxist officers, overthrew his government and ended at last the Ethiopian monarchy after, again, something like 1,700 years. They replaced it with a military junta, which, although it had some successes which won sympathy from leftists elsewhere, in adult literacy, for instance, was in fact even more brutal than Selassie's. In the name of revolution, it spawned the seeds of its own destruction, and its leader went into exile in Zimbabwe, where he remains. Among the new ruler's problems were armed secession movements in Tigray and Eritrea, and I'm simply going to end by note that Eritrea eventually organized a secessionist movement, an armed secessionist movement, and was successful. It established its own independence in the 1990s. Now, a great many people, including myself, have noted the artificiality of Africa's modern borders. After all, every country on the map, it's a true, was drawn by outsiders during the so-called scramble for Africa and so forth. This artificiality, however, once colonialism was past, has essentially remained unchallenged. Ethiopia is the one and only case of official, legal, formalized change in African borders since independence, despite the fact that all of those borders are the direct legacies and products of colonialism. So Ethiopia is today no longer particularly unique. I hope it's not cynical to say that at this point it is another African country struggling with a lot of problems. But what a history. Thank you.